So welcome everybody. On behalf of American Purpose, I'm Jeff Gedman. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this conversation. Others will join as we go, but let's go ahead and keep all of you, including our guests of honor, on time. It's an hour conversation, hard stop 1 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to begin by moderating a bit of a startup conversation for the first 20 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up to the gallery because we have a fabulous group today from different countries around the world, including, of course, the United States and Europe. Our guests of honor, you have their bios. I won't spend a lot of time. We want to dive right into the discussion, but you all know former Estonian president, friend of ours, friend of American Purpose, Toomas Ives, who is a public intellectual. He's a former MP, he's a former head of the Social Democratic Party, he's a former foreign minister, and most recently, President of Estonia. And then joining us from London is Tom Tugendhat, who also doesn't need an introduction, but I take the liberty of saying and reminding you that he is a war vet, Iraq, Afghanistan. He's a polyglot. He speaks Arabic and French. He is a British MP, a conservative, and chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Both these men have tremendous experience, knowledge, and expertise relevant to the discussion today. So, gentlemen, both of you, welcome. And we've had now 3 summits, G7, NATO, in Brussels, and today just concluded in the last hour, President Biden meeting President Putin. And Tom Tugendhat, if I may, I'm going to start with you. I read you on Twitter a few hours ago, and you said, Tom, for those who are hopeful about the Biden-Putin summit, you all have not been paying attention to what this Russia has actually been doing the last 20 years. Can you start there?
Very much so, Jeff. Having your words used against you, this will never catch on as a political technique. The reality is we're looking at a Russia that has effectively been trying to destabilize the norms and practices of the international community for the best part of 20 years. Putin initially, you could perhaps claim, tried to work with the West, but rapidly found that his position was undermined, or I don't just mean undermined abroad, but it was undermined at home. The mafia economy he was running was weakened by the processes that he was seeking to introduce. So instead, he did what he has continued to do since, which is to breach norms, whether it's invading Ukraine in Crimea or capturing Estonian border guards or whatever it happens to be this week, attempting to murder the Prime Minister of Montenegro using chemical weapons in the streets of Salisbury. I can keep going, right? And then to then say, we need to talk about it, as though it was a conversation that could work around it. This is entirely fictitious. There is no attempt to work around it. And the next thing that he will do will be another dead cat, if you like, on the table, just to keep moving things on, to keep upping the ante. So that's why, look, I mean, I think it's a good thing that President Biden makes the effort. Actually, I'm not sure I even think that. I think it's probably worth making the effort. If I were Biden, I'd have probably done it by Zoom, because frankly, this is a guy who is barely worth talking to.
So Tom Tugendhat, that gets us going. And so Tom Ives, President Ives, Angela Stent wrote a book in which she argued that we Americans repeating reset. So George W. Bush and President Obama, and then, well, the oddity of President Trump. I'm going to leave that aside for a second. Is this here we go again, and we're ignorant of history or naive? Where are we now with the new administration? And if you wanted to accelerate and get us focused, what would be the advice you would provide?
Well, first, I would say that this is probably the first, and I think someone made this comment today, I saw on Twitter, this is the first administration that has not tried to do a reset, and that in fact is dealing with Russia as it is, which is something that, first of all, is extremely refreshing for the United States, and perhaps might even be a useful model for much of at least Western Europe, which continues to suffer from an anti-empiricist bias, treating East Europeans as crazy because they're the people who actually have experience with Russia. And this is, which is a curious phenomenon, actually, but, you know, of which I guess the primary example is that when President Macron stated his great vision of working together with Russia against China and promoted this, but he never ever talked to the East Europeans, any of them, until it was out for a while. But I mean, and then we have the mercantilism of much of old Europe, as it were, that would rather not look at Russia's behavior, bad behavior, and instead, as we see with these successive appointments of former leaders to all kinds of highly lucrative positions in various state-owned companies in in Russia, beginning with Schröder, but now it's continued to include the former Kniesel, former foreign minister of Austria, Fillon, the former French prime minister under Sarkozy, two prime ministers of Finland. So, I mean, all of this has muted the European response in a way, I mean, perhaps only comparable to the Trump era, but we're looking at a 20-year period in which everyone seeks a reset and everyone comes away from it disappointed. And I think we need to, you know, after trying through all these presidents to do something, coming up with nothing or worse, after the attempt, that maybe, you know, a little learning is useful. And I think that President Biden has, I think he figured things out a long time ago already. And given the people who he has chosen to put around him and to deal with Russia, Anthony Blinken, who's had a lot of experience with Europe, Tory Newland, who is sort of probably one of the more despised people on the part of Russia because she actually gets it and speaks fluent Russian and has been dealing with them her whole life. I mean, these are the people who would not, I mean, who with their input to President Biden's foreign policy really have a far more realistic view of what Russia is about.
So let me, that's a good and interesting place to stop, because I want to ask the following question to both of you gentlemen. I am always fond of this line by Toynbee, who said a lesson of history is great nations either have an agenda or they become the victim of the agendas of others. What is Vladimir Putin? We have a lot of data now, empirical evidence after 2 decades. What is his agenda with Europe, with the West, with the United States, and what is or what's left of ours? Tom Tugendhat first.
Well, I'm very happy to speak first, but the reality is President Ilves knows the country much better than me. Look, my perception is that the agenda that we're seeing out of Russia is twofold. The first is to guard the power and wealth stolen off the Russian people in a classic monarchical mafia way. If you want to be positive, you call it a monarchy. If you want to be negative, you call it a mafia. Given it doesn't include hereditary power and that we know what a good monarchy looks like, I prefer to call it a mafia. That's the first thing it's trying to do. And the second thing it's trying to do is to destabilize others in order to convince the domestic audience that actually change is pointless, because actually all you'll get is the same. So the point about degrading democracies is not in order to invade or colonize or anything like that. It's simply in order to convince everybody that it's all the same and Russia is no different, no better, no worse, but certainly no worse. And so I think those are its two plans. I don't think it's much more evolved than that. What's ours? Well, ours up until, I was going to say 1990, but I suppose really up until 2004, 5, 6, depending on who you believe, maybe even as far as 2008, with when the markets crashed, was to defend and extend the influence of what we saw, and I think still should see, as liberal Western values that include, liberty, freedom of association, all these different elements. We sum up as a democratic state, but actually it includes many things besides. And I think at the moment, many of us have largely forgotten what we're for. And if you look at foreign offices, whether they're on both sides of the Atlantic, on all sides of Europe, indeed in many parts of the free world, you find beautiful buildings that have forgotten that they have a purpose. They're stage sets onto which walk individuals who file the latest account of the latest meeting, having forgotten that the purpose of the meeting was to extend the influence of the British people, not out of some sort of element of colonial grandeur, but because the interests of the British people are the interests of free people everywhere. And therefore supporting the British people is supporting free people everywhere. And that's where I think that we've gone astray. And actually, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to praise my fellow guest here. This is where President Ilves has been so important. Many world leaders have seen their job as management, effectively, making sure the inflation rate doesn't go beyond 2%, making sure that the debt to GDP ratio doesn't get beyond whatever it is, 60, 70, 80%, depending on which country it is. Of course, they're all now at about 150%. That's another matter. And what President Ilves and the Estonian government have reminded us of consistently for 20 years is we are actually fighting for our freedom. Now, they may be on the front line, but by God, the rear echelon is only a second or two behind.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I never thought of myself that way, but I would say that you have to look at Putin in two somewhat different ways. One is his geostrategic goal, which is basically the dismemberment of the two bodies that actually embody liberal democracy, NATO and the European Union. Ultimately, the real bad guy, the Sauron for the Russian sort of view of what's Mordor, is the United States. And so you want to split Europe away from the United States, which has been working on for a long time. But this was already a Soviet task before the end of the Cold War. And for obvious reasons, that if you can split Europe up, then you don't have 450 or 500 million people who are far richer lined up against you. If you break up NATO, you don't have the most powerful military in the world lined up against you. And every single country in Europe is a lot smaller than Russia. So, that's been kind of a task for a long time. And as I said, it duplicates kind of the worldview of the Soviet establishment up till 1991 or so. And he has done this quite effectively using various means. We know them all, but what I would point out, one, which I find the most pernicious, is he also has, he has waged, and this is the ideological side of this, a frontal assault on the values of the Enlightenment, liberal democracy, the idea of free and fair elections, rule of law, respect for human rights. And what he's managed to do with this ideological assault, which I do not believe he actually believes in, and I know I'll explain why in a minute, It's that I mean, you get in virtually every country in Europe and in the United States now a substantial number of people who actually agree with, who for a variety of reasons, they want to be homophobic, they want to be racist. I mean, they are all there. I mean, and these people have considerable weight in politics. I mean, look at France with Marine Le Pen. You look at, well, in fact, you look at Hungary, and you see in virtually every country small groups. The methods that he is for, as I said, can vary. I think that he did do some effective work with the, most certainly with the Dutch referendum in 2015 on an association agreement for Ukraine using disinformation. There was the Brexit vote where a lot of propaganda was brought in. There was the US election, obviously. Kind of misfired in 2017 with Macron's election, and all means are available. I mean, either you give Macron like Marine Le Pen 9 million euros, or you hack different computers, you buy up politicians. And so the only thing that's worth pointing out is that actually, I think that the military risk from Russia is fairly limited for Europe because, in fact, Putin and all of his mafia, sort of folks actually require the European Union because they don't trust their own government. If you read Richard Pipe's book on Russia and its relationship to property, they've never had property rules. And so people want to launder their money to the West. They know they can always get it there. It's not going to be confiscated by the next czar, the next secretary general. And so you don't really want to invade. I think we're more secure in that sense, but we certainly, I mean, what he seeks is political control of a dismembered European Union and a NATO that has disappeared, and so that's what the challenge that I think that we face is this this fairly like frontal assault on us that we see played out in all these different areas.
So to both of you, this is my last question before we open it up. In light of this frontal assault, for us to push back, to defend ourselves and push back, for us to advance our own agenda, what are those things we need to be thinking about? And I'm going to say beyond rhetoric, gestures, and sanctions. And I'm not suggesting those things are unimportant, but in addition to rhetoric and gestures and sanctions, what are those things that ought to comprise a compelling, outcome-oriented Western strategy? Tom Tugendhat, perhaps you first.
I mean, I think the things that we really need to be thinking about is partnerships, and the President spoke very clearly there about two of them, NATO and the European Union, and they're, I think they're essential. I mean, my own views on Britain's depart from the European Union, it is a mistake. Countries make mistakes all the time, and this isn't the worst of them, but I think it's an error. But the reality is that the European Union, if it were the only grouping, would be too weak on its own. So I think that the importance for us is to look around for partners elsewhere. So I'm keen that we work with CPTPP. I'm keen that we build up the Five Eyes community. I'm keen that we deepen our relationship with India. All of these are things that the UK government is beginning to talk about. And I think these are absolutely fundamental, because the truth is that we defend ourselves by standing with like-minded allies and by encouraging others to be like-minded. So there are plenty of countries, and I won't list them, who are teetering and could go either way towards autocracies, usually under Chinese influence rather than Russian influence, but could go either way. And keeping them on side, keeping them on the side of the angels is, I think, a fundamental duty of foreign policy staffers of any free country.
Thank you, Tom. And then Tom Ilves, President Ilves, please.
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, sanctions have actually been fairly limited. And so, I mean, there are far more dramatic things we can take. You saw, I mean, I think you see the weakness of the West with the sanctions placed on Belarus, where virtually every European country put on their veto list, or that companies or people from companies that they considered important. And so what you end up is the least common denominator of, sort of secondary characters who might be sanctioned. But, if you have a, I mean, that if it's going to be something on Nord Stream 2, Germany will veto it. And, it's going to be something on some other issue, then Austria will do it or Italy will do it. And so there really hasn't been a common purpose. It's a beggar thy neighbor approach. And so unless we can get more commonality, I don't know how we're going to do very much. Certainly US leadership here is absolutely vital because, in fact, if we don't get that, then the mercantilism of the individual member states of the European Union and and the UK as well, outside the EU, will stymie our efforts. And I'm sort of aghast that if the response of the head of foreign policy for the European Union to the news that Russia had blown up an armory in the EU and NATO, and that he said Russia has to stop these disruptive actions. I mean, it was an act of war. I mean, that's, it was not a disruptive action as if it were some kind of, I don't know, something on Facebook that was a lie. So it's limited, and I fear that we will not move forward until we get something really bad from Russia. And even then, you don't know. I mean, if you have, if what we have seen up till now does not get people riled up, then I think that we're in trouble. And I do believe we are in trouble with this. And though I do also believe that if the United States does sort of take a firm stand, that many European countries will fall in line, but asked to do this by themselves. It's the usual list of suspects, the East Europeans, and who, as I said, are viewed as kind of strange people because they actually have experience with Russia. And that's that's kind of it reminds me of a book review of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, where the reviewer and the TLS said, well, what does Solzhenitsyn know about Lenin? I mean, this is what we are faced with in pushing for a tougher position on Russia.
So as I listened to both of you and where you were bringing us, Tom Ilves, I guess I'm in a quoting mood today. I remember to you the quote by Bismarck, who said, every alliance has a horse and a rider. And I remember to Margaret Thatcher, who said, leadership by consensus is an oxymoron. We know increasingly what to do, the nature of the problem, but to bring us together and lead us forward, that seems to remain a challenge. And perhaps President Biden can and will step up. So the floor is open. We have a distinguished group. If you would raise your hand by that hand raising function in Zoom, or raise your hand, Dan Chirot, and I'll recognize you. I'll keep an eye on chat too. And in each case, including friend and colleague Dan Chirot, would you tell the room who you are? And welcome, Dan, from Seattle.
Well, I'm a recently retired professor of international studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. And my original specialty actually was Eastern Europe, but it wasn't Russia or countries farther north, but rather Romania, which despite the fact that it claims to be Latin is actually not really, except in the language. My question is this, it's a lot of what Putin is doing is actually self-destructive for Russia. The economy is stagnating, the demographic situation is very bad. And over time, it really means keeping on going in this direction will make Russia ever more dependent, ultimately, on China. Now, at what point do the people who support Putin, who, as you both pointed out, and by the way, I really liked everything you said and agree with you, at what point do his supporters realize that they're digging their own grave if they keep on going indefinitely in this direction? I do know that there is a deep suspicion in Russia for a long time of China. And I also know from having visited China that a lot of Chinese, at least in the professional groups that I know, have utter contempt for the Russians. I mean, that's not official, but you can hear it from them. At what point is there going to be some realization on the part of important Russians that they're heading for this? And is there anything we can do to help them come to that realization?
Well, there's by the Yangtze River on the Chinese side is a museum of friendship between China and Russia, but they don't let in Russians because it's so anti-Russian. I suspect that the people that Putin relies on to stay in power, the Siloviki and the oligarchs, all have amassed enough money and probably property either in Miami or on the Riviera that they all figure they'll leave, because the utter contempt that they have had for the Russian people in the way they rule, I mean, placing the health care even of Russians sort of on the back burner in order to put their own sort of desires ahead of the well-being of the country. I suspect they all have an escape route. You know, they're all going to say, okay, where am I going to run to when the whole thing collapses? And I don't really, I mean, looking at the immense resources of that country and how they have been squandered, which, I mean, so that my country coming out of the Soviet Union is now like 3 times richer per capita than Russia, which is utterly ridiculous, that it should be that they should be so poor. It's just, this is astounding. I mean, this is 30 years of mismanagement and greed, and that's where it's taken this country. So I don't see that sense of responsibility for the Russian people. And you can see this in the actions of Putin, beginning already with the bombings in Ryazan and elsewhere in 1998, 99. It's the value of Russian life to these people seems to be minimal. So obviously they don't really care much about the rest of the world, people's lives in the world. So it's greed, I'd say.
Tom Tugendhat?
Look, I mean, I agree entirely with your point, Professor Chirot. I think the point you're making, that this is short-termist theft, is, you know, this is a bit like the balloon problem. You know, you're holding onto a rising balloon. After a certain point, you've simply got to hang on, and a lot of the people that are surrounding themselves or surrounding President Putin have now simply got to hang on, because either he survives and they keep their cash, or he does not and they're in trouble. So I suspect we'll see more people, you know, doing what they're doing now over the coming years. But what we're also watching, by the way, is, and absolutely, I mean, Shakespeare could have written it, is the end of days of a dying king. Because however strong you think Putin is today, the reality is this is a man who's approaching his 70s, and one thing I can be pretty certain about is he's going to die at some point, and I don't know whether he's going to die at 80 or 90 or God knows even 100. But once he hits 70, young people in his court will start to think not about the past but the future, and they will start to make plans. And as they make plans, they will start to have ideas about themselves. This is, by the way, this is perfectly traditional. This is what happens to presidents and prime ministers too, and just on a much shorter reign. With kings, it ends up being rather more violent. And at some point, Putin is either going to have to kill a lot of young princes, which he's beginning to do, or he is going to be overthrown, because that's what happens in aging monarchies. You either kill the young Turks who are challenging you, or you end up getting killed.
But the question is, will it be reduced to a gang war a la the US mafia? If we're dealing with a mafia, I mean, there's, Mario Puzo's Godfather, right? You get different families and they're just going to someone else will try to take that position because it's so lucrative.
I suspect it will, to some degree.
So before we move on to the next, and thank you, Dan Chirot, I want to ask a follow-on to Dan's question. Can we, United States, Europe, the West, do more through our intelligence services, through international media, through the support of investigative journalism, to expose internally for Russians what the Putin oligarch, I'll say gangster class, is doing to exploit and to pillage? Do ordinary Russians know as much as they should know? Can we help them know more about what's happening with their money in offshore accounts, in real estate abroad, and so on?
Can I jump in on that, Jeff, just very quickly, and say, a point I've made to our foreign secretary, and I've made it to various other foreign ministers at various points. We keep talking about sanctioning the Putin regime as though it's going to make the blindest bit of difference. They don't care about the sanctions on their people. They only care about their own wealth. And most of them have got enough money that the sanctions don't make a difference. I will not believe that we are serious about dealing with Russia until I see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and Le Monde and every other major paper around the world a spider diagram with the $200 to $300 billion stolen off the Russian people identified in bank accounts around the world and the routes it has taken. And please don't tell me that we can't do this. Of course we can. We just haven't bothered to do it, or we haven't asked the questions, or, this is literally what our intelligence services and our treasury teams can do and do for illicit financing. Do it for the president of Russia. And if you do it and expose it, that will expose him and your sanctions are serious. And if you don't, please don't waste my time telling me that you're serious. You're not serious.
So Tom, before I go back to President Ilves, may I ask you the follow-on? Is part of the problem that the Russian regime and Russian oligarchs cannot engage in these types of activities without our help as enablers, Western financial institutions, our real estate laws, and so forth? Is that a part of the pickle, the predicament we find ourselves in?
Well, it's partly that. And by the way, I welcome very much President Biden's words the other day about fighting corruption. We need to be prepared to fight corruption at home. And I'm not going to talk about the United States when I have such a visible example of it here in London. The reality is that one of the first reports that we did when I took over the presidency of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the chairmanship, of the Foreign Affairs Committee, was on Russian dirty money in the UK. And this wasn't about sort of closing off Russia. This was about protecting the UK, because dirty money and corruption flowing through your system is like a poison. It twists lawyers, it diverts accountants, it corrupts estate agents or realtors, as you'd put it. It is a net harm to our economies, and we must fight it. We must fight it just as we're fighting this virus today. And I think that we need to be rather more robust on that. Now, it would have impacts for the small elements of the city, that's true. And it would have presumably impacts for small elements of the United States as well. But the reality is clean markets with integrity are the fundamental building block of the system that we claim to defend, of our liberties and our future freedoms and innovations. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a no-brainer, and we have effectively decided to go naked into a bar rather than to dress ourselves in armor. And I think that's deeply unwise.
This
So,
is
so thank you.
fundamental-
Tom Ilves. Yeah, please.
It's a fundamental problem. I mean, we see this across Europe and in the United States. We saw it under the Trump administration. We see it in Germany, Italy, France, Austria. There was a picture taken of someone leaving 10 Downing Street right after the MH17 shoot down, giving instructions to the EU to roundly condemn the Russian actions, but do nothing that would harm investment in the UK. I mean, this is across the board, and every single country, including mine, has lobbyists who will fight against taking strong actions because it might ruin something. I mean, you have the entire Ostausschuss, or the Eastern Committee of German industrialists, who have for 30 years been pushing against any kind of action against Russia, and even against the enlargement of the European Union and NATO, because they figure, well, they'd get better deals if they're successful. So, I mean, the role of Eastern money and its allure is something that we really have to take a completely different look at this.
Okay, thank you both. I saw that our colleague in the gallery, Ellen, had a hand up. If you, Ellen, are still there, would like to ask a question or make a comment, you're invited at this time.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Ellen Danick in Denver, Colorado. I actually don't work in your industry. I own a small candy company. I'm just interested in the topic. I sent a direct message to the member of parliament who was just speaking. I'm wondering if, building on what he was talking about, if England has anything in place like the Magnitsky Act here in the US. I think people can talk about how much impact Magnitsky has and hasn't had, but is there anything like that in place in England?
Yeah, the United Kingdom does have a Magnitsky Act, and we also have various other forms of sanctions available, including something that isn't available in the United States, the unexplained wealth order, which is if you are the spouse of the former deputy president of country X, and you have bought yourself an £11 million house and your annual salary is $70,000, that house can be seized and its gain and its profits held and returned to people because you cannot explain the source of your wealth. So we do have various different acts, but the reality is these are, they're very tactical. I mean, I'm not saying that they're irrelevant. They're certainly not irrelevant, and they are important, but they're very tactical. And you're fighting a fire by blowing out matches.
Thank you.
So thank you. I would like to go to Michael Allen and then Senator Gordon Humphrey. Michael, you first, and if you would, we know who you are, and please identify yourself nevertheless.
Thank you. Excuse me. Michael Allen with the National Endowment for Democracy and Democracy Digest blog. The recent Munich, the recent Munich security report outlined that European public opinion, particularly in countries like France and Italy, is very skeptical of US and British approaches to Russia. In other words, there's a significant Russophile element within public opinion, and even, as I recall, large pluralities in the region of 45–43% believe in the event of a US-Russia conflict that Europeans should remain neutral. We've also heard recently from President Macron suggesting that any conflict with Russia would be I think he called it a strategic error, which would precipitate confrontation or push Moscow into the arms of China. So given that both at the level of public opinion and among certain members of the elite, there's a reluctance to confront Russia, and I suppose the Nord Stream pipeline also suggests that interests are trumping ideals in certain respects. Given these parameters, how realistic is it to suggest that democracies should present a united front against Putin?
Thomas,
Who'd like to be first?
I'm very happy to do it. Look, I mean, I think I think there are challenges, right? And there are long-standing challenges, and they are for the very obvious reasons of proximity, of economics, of political histories that you can run through France's political history, and you see a very different political history to the United Kingdom. You see a much stronger connection to Russia at various points. You see a long link. I don't mean a Putinist link, but a link between White Russia and France that exists and is still alive today. That it doesn't exist in other parts. You see a relationship in Eastern Germany to Russia that isn't the same as other places. So look, I mean, it's certainly true that these things are so, but never forget that in 1936, when asked to vote, people basically were very clear that they weren't going to vote for king and country against a fascist Germany. And then, of course, 3 years later, when the time came, they did, right? And the reality is countries like France and Germany, they made their choice on this 70 years ago. The reality is Russia is undermining them, and they know it. And you're right that there is elite capture, and you can speak about François Fillon if you like, but these are, by and large, in political terms, long dead characters who are selling. I mean, I'm amazed how much the devil pays for a soul that has already been declared worthless.
I am also well, I'm skeptical that until some of these things are in the West are also made clear. So it's not simply the oligarchs and Siloviki whose money in the West needs to be exposed. I think that it will be, I mean, some good Bellingcat or otherwise investigative journalism is actually actually can do more, I think, because it's more embarrassing to be a Western politician who's found out to be bought. You can shrug it off in Russia, and you do manage to control the media so it doesn't get out, but it's hard to do that in the West. And I think sort of deep dives into some of these people's behavior and activities would be much in order to actually cause some kind of public resentment and uproar.
Thank you. Could I turn, please, to Senator Humphrey, Gordon Humphrey, and then to Bill Galston? Senator, are you still there?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. It seems to me, if I may observe, there is a common thread running through all of this conversation thus far. Diverse has been that conversation, and it's maybe this question, maybe in the form of a question: why isn't the United States, and for that matter, the West, why are they not better telling their story, the story of our values, democracy, free elections, rule of law? We're losing the information war, and the question is why and what should be done about it. The Russian Internet Research Agency and its surrogates is doing a splendid job in telling lies, largely using the new medium of the internet and social platforms. And we, for our part, are doing a very poor job of telling the truth and promoting, not only promoting our values, but using our values to destabilize these regimes, such as in Moscow and Beijing and Tehran and North Korea and elsewhere. Why are we telling our story so poorly, and what can be done about it? That's the question I want to pose. Naturally, I have some ideas on that subject, but I'd like to leave it as a question.
Well, I think the one quick answer is that they're shutting it down. I mean, it was actually one of the items for Biden, I think, was that RL, of which both Jeff and I are veterans, I mean, basically is being shut down. The free media in Russia is being shut down. I mean, and when it comes to China, I mean, nothing gets in because, this was the Great Firewall of China is very effective and nothing really gets in there. So people, 30 years later, people don't even know about Tiananmen Square in that country where this grotesque massacre took place.
mean, I think there are two elements to this. The first is that some countries, Russia in particular, they're not trying to get a single message out. They're trying to get every message out. They're backing, the extreme left and the extreme right. They're backing, all they're trying to do is cause destruction. They're not trying to build, and that's easier. Frankly, as anybody who's ever invaded a country knows, it is much easier to invade than reconstruct. That's the first point. And the second is, if I'm honest, Senator, I think we've lost faith in ourselves. I speak to politicians today, and I don't care whether you're talking about Western Europe or North America or indeed other parts of the world, who believe that their job is to fix the pothole and manage the domestic, which it is, but don't see it as to extend the sphere of influence and to defend the interests in the wider world. And I think that's a mistake. We won the Cold War and then sort of took our foot off the gas and lay back in the sun lounger and started smoking cigars. Well, they didn't.
Yes.
They didn't.
Yeah. Well, can I jump in there and espouse a few things as quickly as possible? First, taking the U.S. Information Agency and its counterparts among our allies. I don't want to overstate the case, but it did a much better, not that it was without problems, but it did a much better job during the Cold War than we've done since Congress unfortunately dismantled the USIA and split it in half going to what is now the U.S. Agency for Global Management, which does a terrific job, in my opinion, and more power to them. And the other part going to the State Department, where it became submerged in a larger agenda and professional jealousies, I would say. Here's an astounding statistic backed up by a spreadsheet maintained by Matt Armstrong, who is a former governor on the Broadcasting Board of Governors and a former executive director, I think, of the U.S. Commission on Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, which is a State Department office, which a spreadsheet that shows the astounding fact that this office, which was created, the Office of Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy at the State Department, which was created to take over that half or more of that was chopped away from USIA, has been vacant these last 21 years, 40% of the time. It's vacant now, 6 months into the new administration. I know Joe Biden, served with him 12 years. He's a very intense, sincere guy, but he's got his hands full. He can't be on top of every detail. And sorry to say, I don't think he or the secretary or national security advisor are on top of this particular one, much as I admire all three. That office is vacant 6 months into the administration. Furthermore, all those public diplomacy functions that are lumped under that office are scattered throughout which that office has authority and duty to coordinate, are scattered throughout the executive. Imagine if we dismantled the Pentagon and scattered its responsibilities among the executive departments. What a horror that would be. Well, public diplomacy is every bit as important now, in the last 10 years, as warfare by kinetic means, to use the new term, which is a delightful term. So public diplomacy and kinetic warfare are the same. In effect, we need a Pentagon for public diplomacy. The last thing, I've gone on too long already, but here's the evidence. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former prime minister of Denmark, I guess, right? His organization commissioned a poll earlier this year in 53 countries, and it found that among those polled, 42%, I think it was, I'm looking at my notes, 44% of respondents saw the US as a greater threat to democracy than China or Russia. And China was ranked second, and Putin's Russia, third. I'm a Russophile, by the way. I love the Russian people, but I don't so much love Putin. Russia was ranked least as a threat to democracy in this poll, which covered nations that embrace 75% of the world's populations. So there's the proof. We're telling our story badly. I think I've pointed out the reasons why, and I hope in your country, Mr. Charles, that you can do something about that. I'm trying to stir up some trouble here on that score, as you can tell. Thank you.
Senator Humphrey, thank you. We're going to be back another time to dig deeper into that. I apologize to you all that we have Pia Charles showing on the screen for Tom Tugendhat. That's just a little tech glitch there. I'm going to turn now probably to the last question. Bill Galston of Brookings, columnist, Wall Street Journal, editorial board, American Purpose, and just a few other things. Bill, you have the floor. And you need to unmute.
Yes. Well, first of all, as a member of the editorial board of American Purpose, I think I can speak for the entire journal in expressing my personal gratitude that you've been willing to spend an hour with us in such a searching conversation. And I'll be a bit presumptuous to hope that it won't be the last time we'll be seeing you in this capacity. Having dragooned you, I'll now impose a question on you. It is my distinct impression that much of Europe is reluctant to get drawn into a struggle between the United States and China. And that is understandable but unfortunate, because I think the future of the United States and much else besides in the 21st century will be determined by the outcome of that struggle. So a two-part question. First of all, is my perception that important parts of Europe are perceptibly reluctant to get drawn in correct? And secondly, what can the American president and American diplomats do over time to begin to break down this reluctance and convince Europe that our struggle is also your struggle?
I think we've seen a big change in the past year or so. And there are two, the former head of GCHQ put it very well. He said, Russia is bad weather, China is climate change. And I think that in Europe, slowly that is becoming clearer as we have seen the bad behavior of Russia when it comes to their wolf warrior diplomacy, which is extremely nasty. As we see, the European Union gets most upset about trade distortions, and after all, Huawei is cheaper than either Ericsson or Nokia because they have such huge state subsidies. So I think that it is changing, and here I think that actually the kind of bipartisan view in the United States that China is a major threat, and indeed climate change, I think is also beginning to sink in because of the kind of partisan tendencies of Europe itself. Sees that, well, if both sides of the aisle in the United States are concerned, then maybe there's reason to be. On the other hand, it is, some of the solutions are also unhappy. I mentioned before Macron's view that we should ally ourselves with Russia in order to be against China is not perhaps the smartest way, I would say, to do this, given what all that would entail. But I think people are waking up. Just to be quick, where I think it's failing is that in the tech realm, we still see a Europe more obsessed with harnessing or reining in US technology rather than working together on tech with the United States itself, falling way behind from behind the US, not to mention, of course, China.
Thank you. Tom Tugendhat, would you like a word on Bill Galston's question?
Well, the only thing I'll say, because I know you're going to want to get more questions in, is Bill, invite me back and we'll talk China more long term. I'm very happy to get into that. I think you're right that there is a different perspective in Europe, but I think that President Ilves is completely correct that the last year has really sharpened the view. So all I would say as a massive Atlanticist is, dear friend.
So time is racing. We do our best to run a tight ship to keep you on time, our guests of honor, and our colleagues in the gallery. Not only, I think, Bill, would we like to have President Ilves and Mr. Tugendhat back with us, but I'd like to propose that you two co-write an article for us called Massive Atlanticism. That sounds to me like a good and right title. Let me give you an advertisement before we leave, and I thank you both more properly. So as we had you two Russia Hawks today, we're going to continue tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern. It's good to mix things up, so we thought we'd have a dove. And so we've invited former National Security Advisor John Bolton. You know what a softie he can be on these issues. And then on Friday, 12 noon Eastern, Bill Galston will be back with us to moderate George Packer, because we do have our challenges at home, across the West, and in the United States. George of the New Yorker and the Atlantic has written a terrific new book on crisis and renewal in America. He'll be with us Friday, 12 noon Eastern. But now, at 1.5 minutes before the hour, Tom Tugendhat and Tom, President Ilves, what a pleasure to tap into your knowledge and expertise. It not only informs us, but it inspires us, and we need that. So I thank you both very, very much.
Well, thank you for inviting. It was great. And I finally got to talk to Tom Tugendhat, who otherwise I know, but we never talked.
So let's convene in person in the fall.
That would be great.
Here, here.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, great evening. Bye now.
Bye.